Hi, this is Alicia, and I created this video to demonstrate a typical day in my science classroom during my time with Teach for America. About half the skills I used to develop my style of teaching I got through my training with Teach for America, but the other half I took from my experience in the private sector. Specifically, my lessons started to look more and more like presentations that I may have created for a prospective or for a current client. So in this first version of setting up a lesson for the day, you'll see the format that was taught to me during the summer teacher training. The training specifies that on a section of the classroom board, the teacher should clearly write out the homework they do now, and I'll explain what that is shortly, the objective of today's class so that students have some context for what they're going to learn on that day, and a section that I added titled Agenda, which is just bullets so that the students know how the time is going to be split up. Now, as you can see from the image, it's not possible to write out the information in a very small space, and very quickly it became obvious that this format wouldn't work. There really just isn't enough space on the board. So, in this second version, I sacrificed one of my two boards to display the information. Doing this helped me write the information much more clearly in the space and made it easier for my students in the farthest corner of the room to see the board. Still, writing this information on a daily basis felt like a tremendous waste of time, and it meant that I can only use one board at a time, and I would be facing away from my students while teaching. So it was time for technology. I asked myself, how would I do it if I wasn't bound by my training? I decided to just make everything digital. I created a structure for the class that would be executed in the same way every day. And so really, we're almost reducing the discomfort and the learning curve in this case. So picture this setup. As soon as students entered the classroom, they would see this up on the projector. They would take their seats, they would write down their homework in their planners, and they would begin the do now. The do now is a 5 to 10 minute task that should be completed by the students immediately upon, beginning the class. The benefit is that there's never any doubt or any confusion as to the official start of the class, hence the name Do Now. The Do Now is not meant to be a huge lesson, but rather it gets students into that class mode since they've had several minutes of talking and interacting with their peers in the hallway while they were switching periods. Afterwards, we'd cover what's going to be in the lesson of that particular day, and I would split this up into two categories. There is a language objective on the left and the daily benchmark on the right. The language objective covers the vocabulary of what we're going to learn. In this case, it reads, students will be able to compare constructive earth processes, such as deposition, from destructive earth processes, such as weathering and erosion. The underlined terms, of course, are intentional, and they're meant to signal to the students that these are the words that we're going to use throughout the day's lesson. And just to get them to interact a little bit, of course, students would be the ones to read from the board at this time. On the right is the daily benchmark, which reads, students will be able to define and give examples of how deposition and rock formation build up Earth's surfaces. Following this is the agenda/announcement slide. This slide is meant to show the students what the format the class will take. In this case, they'll know if there will be a worksheet, an experiment, a game, a documentary, etc. I placed check marks over the first three items to give students a sense of how much we've already covered in today's class, and really this is just a psychological boost because by the time we're on the slide, we're really only 10 to 15 minutes into the class, and really we have about 45 to 50 minutes left for the lesson itself. This is a slide where I begin the day's lesson officially. Before I introduce new material, I discuss everything that we've covered in that particular unit to date. In this case, it's a geology unit that we've covered, so we start with geology as a concept, which is here on the top left, the layers of the Earth, followed by convection in the mantle, plate tectonics, Earth's features created by plate tectonics, such as mountains, volcanoes, and trenches, changes to the Earth's feature, and then finally, in green at the bottom, we have what we've learned, or rather what we're going to learn, which is constructive and destructive earth processes. The reason I do it in this way is because I want the students to understand how we went from a macro understanding of geology and are now narrowing it down to the micro. Still, not all students understand the connections based on the flowchart, and so I re-show them a video that we might have seen in an earlier lesson to really help reestablish that connection. At this point, we're about 20 to 25 minutes into the class and they're primed for the new material. So I begin by setting expectations for the student's behavior during the new lesson. In this case, it reads, students will silently follow along during Ms. Redondo's presentation and take notes. Students will quickly but neatly write down the information that is written in red and ask questions if they are confused. Understanding that these students are coming from elementary school, I teach them how to take notes on a piece of paper as opposed to filling out worksheets, which is what they've been accustomed to at this point. And I remind them to write everything down that is in red. So this is an example of what your paper should look like. I will skip down the slides very quickly since the content of this lesson aren't really relevant for this video, but the one thing to note here is the consistency in the slides is very important so that students don't have to think about where to look or what to write. This means consistency in the red versus black text, the visual aids accompanying each one of the definitions, so on and so forth. Finally, I end the lesson with a video of an eruption from Mount St. Helens, not only to demonstrate some of these concepts that we just discussed in action, but also to give them a reward for diligently taking notes, because who doesn't love a good video of exploding volcanoes? I always end the class with a slide alerting them to pack up their desk. Also important to let them know that they can come to me with any questions, but most importantly, I do like to thank them for being in the class and for participating in the lesson. You may not know who this little guy is, but at some point a lot of the students would, because I do talk to them about Carl Sagan, who I deeply admire, and it's just kind of a boost for them to look for different role models outside of sports and media. I'll create another video on a lesson that followed this one to show how this information presented is retaught to the children, and this time in a really fun and interactive way that allows them to compete and get out some of their energy in the classroom. So thanks for watching this video, and I hope that it successfully demonstrated a typical day in my science classroom during my time with Teach for America. Cheers.